topic of suffering is a difficult one, not least because it's so personal. We can empathize with the struggle of another, but each of us has our own call, our own path marked out by the Lord for, in our imitation of him, following after him. He's carrying the cross, and he asks his disciples to also carry the cross, to follow. That is Christianity, a following of Jesus Christ, and to the glory of his resurrection, but it passes by way of the passion and crucifixion. It's something that each one of us has to look to. And during these times of COVID, I was talking to Father James, and just before, he'd been meditating on these priests who were receiving lepers. He was wondering, what sort of personal equipment, the PPE, protective equipment they had, how to do the examination without themselves being infected. But you see, with our Lord, he touches them. Extraordinary. And there have been saints who certainly have done the same, and they contracted leprosy. If you ever look at the story of Molokai and St. Damien, very moving. I know of people in this time of COVID who have been unable to attend the funeral of their mum, of their dad. So many people unable to see grandchildren, unable to have that human touch, which as human beings we need. Particularly difficult to feel that kind of isolation, that loneliness. And then Lent, as that starts next week, in a sense we go with our Lord in that following of him into the desert, into that loneliness. Some people have been saying, well, we've been going through a very, very long Lent in that regard. Thanks be to God, we're able to gather together to worship. Those on live streaming, that's all very good, but we need to come together to worship the Lord as an assembly, called by God. We need to be able to see and touch. And we're going to receive Jesus himself in the Eucharist. He's not someone we read about, talk about. It's someone we go into communion with him. He has become one of us, and he unites himself to each one. Whether we're aware of it or not, whether we give thanks or not, he's with us. And the point of Lent, in our own frustrations, in our difficulties, even at times for good purpose, when we are thirsting and hungering for righteousness, because we are angry at injustice, we need to be with Jesus. He's with us, but we need to be more and more at the forefront in our minds, in our hearts, in what we are thinking about, that we focus our eyes on him. And ultimately, as we come to the end of Lent, and we have that beautiful hymn of the Stabat Mater, of Mary at the foot of the cross, just to be in wonder and to gaze at that mother looking at her only son. What was in her mind, in her heart? I can somehow look towards that. Those of you who are mothers would have a much deeper appreciation of the sorrow of Our Lady. But this is Christianity, that in the midst of that great sadness, there is hope. Faith in the resurrection, faith in God. And ultimately that is rewarded. I mean, you could imagine in the day of Easter the joy of Our Lady in having that encounter with her son. And that is also our hope too, that one day in heaven we too will rise as Christ has risen in a glorious body. At the end of the creed, we say we believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's us. But even here and now, in following by this way of the cross, in the midst of that sorrow, there has to be that joy of the resurrection, that hope of the resurrection, that anticipation of the resurrection, which is what we experience in receiving Jesus in the Eucharist.